We have a special guest today, and his name is Carl Delfeld. He's a Hayes Seward Senior Fellow at the Center for Economic Security, a Chief Global Analyst at Cabot Wealth, and author of new book, Power Rivals, America and China's Superpower Struggle. I'm Sean Kenny, and this is Rock Logic. Carl, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Nice to be with you, Sean.
Now, before we get started here, and before we kind of get into the crux of everything, you want to give us a little bit of your background, just
Sure.
how you got started, and just kind of go from there.
Sure. Well, I grew up in Wisconsin, which is about as far from Asia as you can think of. But
Yeah.
I got introduced to what I'm doing now, studying in Japan during college for a year at a Jesuit university there. And then that led to some graduate study in international economics. And then I went into finance, investments, worked on Capitol Hill here in Washington, worked with U.S. Treasury, and then was appointed by Bush 41 to the board of the Asian Development Bank in Manila, Philippines.
Wow.
And that kind of introduced Southeast Asia and China, because that's in early 90s when China was just, really starting to really take off. And then we moved to Colorado, where there's a lot of rocks, and I raised a family there. And about 5 years ago, I moved back to Washington because of my concern about what was going on between the U.S. and China. And also, it's in my book, but it's not a big part of the book. I got concerned about China's dominance in rare earths and rare metals, and the vulnerability that put America in. So I have a couple of initiatives in that area we can talk about later.
Yeah, we've definitely done quite a bit of coverage on rare earth materials on the show. We've had a couple of people speaking on that behalf. So just getting kind of right into it, you actually, you're actually an accomplished author, and you have several books under your name. One that just recently came out called Power Rivals, which talks about the struggle between the U.S. and China. If you don't mind, sir, would you kindly just kind of go into a little
Sure.
Yeah.
So I wrote the book for two reasons. The first is that I thought that policymakers here, businessmen, Americans in general, were still complacent about the rivalry between the U.S. and China. In fact, when I first moved here, nobody wanted to call China a rival because they didn't think it was deemed worthy of that. Where that's changed now. Now I think Washington's woke up, and like everything in Washington, they don't plan, they react, and then they overreact. And you see some of that happening now with Taiwan and so on. And then the second reason I wrote the book is I think this decade is going to be this decisive decade where America's struggling to stay a superpower and China's struggling to become one and wants to push the U.S. off its pedestal. So the U.S. has got to be alert and to take steps to keep its superpower status because it's crucial to our economic, financial, and national security.
Right, of course. And you make some predictions in the book, and you even go as far as making some projections about 8 years out. If you don't mind, obviously, I haven't read the book yet, but I plan on getting it pretty soon. It's on its way. It's actually on its way here. So I look forward to reading that myself. I do know that you do make some projections in the book going as far as 8 years out. If you don't mind me asking, where do you see the United States in 2030, and where do you see China in 2030?
Well, I think I do make some projections, but it's sort of based on trend lines now and trajectories now. If we're on the current trend lines, it's not going to be very pretty. I mean, China's going to be a bigger economy and maybe substantially bigger. Our stock market, which has been on quite a run, is going to have like a 70s like stagflation performance where, in the 70s, the stock market was flat. And China is slowing a little bit with COVID and everything. But just to kind of give you a trend line, I mean, in 2000, China represented 3% of GDP, world GDP. We were 28.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a football score, 28-3 at halftime. You're pretty happy, right? Where
Mm-hmm.
now the score is basically 24-17 or 18. So
Yeah.
now they're within a touchdown of overcoming us. It's very different. Another trend line is that we've added $10 trillion of debt to our national debt in the last 5 years alone.
Mm.
So we both have debt problems. So a lot depends on what happens from here on out. I'll give you one other number, which is pretty shocking, is that since 1990, China's grown at an average annual clip of 10.5%, where we've been 2.5%. So each
Mm-hmm.
year we fall, a bit further behind, or they catch up a little bit faster. So by
Yeah.
2030, it could be a situation, depending on what happens with Taiwan. I mean, China already represents 50% of Asian GDP, 50% of Asian military spending. In many ways, China is already an Asian superpower. And by 2030, maybe people refer to China and US as the two superpowers. And really, that's not a superpower. A superpower is dominant in their hemisphere, and no other power in the rest of the part of the world is really its peer rival. That's what a
Mm.
superpower is, and that's what we are now. But that could be totally different in 2030.
Okay, and I guess a follow-up question to that, and I
Sure.
totally agree with your stance on the United States, where, by all intents, we're hearing a lot of economists say that we're probably going to be going into a recession here pretty soon.
Mm-hmm.
We're seeing beyond 8.5% inflation, so there's a lot of risk of recession, possibly even stagflation, and that's not good for anybody here and abroad, but.
Yes.
China is certainly not without its problems, but I do agree that over the last 3 decades they have been growing at a pretty steady pace. I'm wondering, do you see any recent trends? So there's obviously been a lot of movement for the United States to kind of get back into the foundry business in terms of building semiconductors.
Right.
There's been a lot of issues with supply chains, and there's been a lot of people questioning whether it's a smart idea to have all of their major supply chain infrastructure in one country, especially one that's as adversarial as China. Do you see any recent changes that might change those projections in terms of China getting to, at least from an economic standpoint, to superpower status?
Yes. Well, those are all good questions, and questions are the key. Normally when I talk about the book, I talk about how did this happen? How did we let China catch up so quickly?
Mm.
And how does it impact me or my family or my country? And then the third is, what do we do now? That's kind of the three questions I always think
Yeah.
of. But getting to the questions you asked, I would say, I think if it depends, China is slowing down a little bit, but it could be just COVID. We can't get complacent because they still have a huge potential. The big advantage they have is scale. So, we're 330 million people. They're 1.4 billion. They're 4 times larger than us. So, in terms
Mm.
of scale and speed, that's what drove them forward over the last 3 or 4 decades.
Mm-hmm.
They still have 40% of their workers in rural areas. So they can still come into the factories.
Mm-hmm.
So, and they're still by far the largest manufacturer, about 25% of global value-added manufacturing. They're by far the largest trading. So if they just keep those trends and keep growing them, they're going to close that gap. Now, a lot depends on politics too. That's why I say really politics is very important. What
Mm.
happens with US politics? Because China looks at us. I can tell you how they look at us. They look at us as distracted, divided, and in decline. That's the way they
Mm-hmm.
look at it. So we have to accept that and say, well, how do we change that image, change that brand, and get back on track? Because I can tell you here in Washington, where they're debating this semiconductor bill, we talked about semiconductors. Nothing's
Mm-hmm.
getting done because they're just so fragmented here that compared to China, who when they make a decision, they move on it. So that's, you know, it a lot depends on politics. A lot depends on the global economy. You know, we can, you know, what's happening in Ukraine, what's happening with Taiwan. There's a lot of flashpoints out there that could change the trajectory of everything. But getting to semiconductors, it's really interesting. I know you know a lot about like gallium and some of the minor metals that are crucial.
Mm-hmm.
China dominates those. It's not just rare earths. Well, you know this better than I do. A lot of the semiconductor input materials, China dominates the refining of them. And they've been on a buying spree over the last 2 decades all over the world to lock down other supplies and then bring them back for refining. So U.S., you're right. I mean, we believe in the market. The market said foundry business is a terrible business. We want to be in the design business, 40% margins, you know, lots of money to be made, and we'll let Taiwan Semiconductor or Samsung make the chips. Well, that was very short-sighted, you know, and that's one of our flaws is the free market helps us, but it also leads to some strategic blunders.
I completely agree with you. And I also argue that you're not really dealing with a free market when you're dealing with China, because China, you know, has in the past and in many ways still does subsidize whole industries in order to obtain market share in whether that's rare earths. We're starting to see that in the nuclear industry, and I might have some questions about that later.
Yes.
I also have some questions about Taiwan, but before I do, I guess you know, we're talking about China. Obviously, they're in a bit of a slowdown period right now with COVID, with the supply chain shortages, with all the market disruptions that we've seen in the last 2 years. But aside from all that, and assuming that they recover, what would China need to do specifically to obtain superpower status? You know, is it just building out its navy even more than it has? Is it you know, is it, you know, expanding upon the Belt and Road Initiative? Like, what does China need to do specifically to obtain the same status of what you would define as a military superpower, not just an economic superpower, but a military one?
Well, first of all, they have to soften up their foreign policy. That's really been a really inexplicable blunder over the last decade. Is they've gotten very aggressive with, for example, the countries in Southeast Asia and with the United States. They really haven't been, from a diplomatic point of view, very effective. And then the other thing is they need to lighten up on their private sector. I mean, their private sector is roughly a quarter of their companies, but it produces well over half their GDP. And on the other hand, they have these big state-owned companies, which are very dominant, produce a lot of revenue, but are not all that profitable and not all that flexible. I'll give you an example. There's something out there called the Fortune Global 500. It's the top 500 firms in the world ranked by revenue. In 1990, they had no companies on the list, China. By 2021, last year, they led America 135 to 122, which surprises the heck out of most Americans. But 75% of those companies are state-owned companies. So if they can use a lighter touch and privatize some of those companies, that could give them a whole nother decades and decades of growth. Military spending, I mean, it's really going up quickly. I mean, Chinese military spending is 5 times that of China now. They have the largest navy in the world. And don't forget, for us, it's an away game. I know you're going to get to Taiwan, but that Taiwan is 6,000 miles from California and 8,000 miles from Washington, where it's only 100 miles off the coast of China. So it's definitely an away game for the United States, which makes it much more difficult.
Yeah, no, I would definitely agree on that. And obviously, I don't want there to be a war between China and Taiwan. I know a lot of people say it's inevitable. I still think that you know, for China, I think that there's a lot of pitfalls to engaging in a massive amphibious landing of Taiwan. And maybe you have a maybe you have a different opinion in regards to. I mean, we can get into it right now. Do you
Sure.
foresee China actually pulling the trigger on this and engaging in a military adventure similar to what Russia did in Ukraine? I know that the circumstances are very different, and obviously Taiwan is very different from Ukraine, and that, as you pointed out, the semiconductor industry in Taiwan, builds most of the semiconductors for a lot of not just American companies, but a lot of companies around the
Right.
world in a number of different fields: automotive, electronics, military technology. So
Yes.
obviously, there's a lot more. One could make the argument that the U.S. has a bit more skin in the game in regards to its commitments to helping Taiwan out in its time of need. We can argue as to whether or not they would actually fulfill those commitments, but I guess the real question is, do you foresee China actually going in within the next, let's say, 3 to 5 years, engaging in that kind of military adventure in East Asia?
I think there's a decent probability. I mean, if I'm going to pick a number, I'd probably pick about a 30 to 35% chance.
Okay.
And a lot depends on politics because Xi Jinping is, getting older, and he's going this fall for a third 5-year term.
Mm,
It's a sacred mission to return Taiwan to the motherland.
mm,
So they really want it. It all depends on our deterrence, whether we can, ourselves and Taiwan and our allies can deter China from taking action, because the Ukraine situation shows them, the difficulty. Of course, it's a completely different situation.
mm,
Taiwan is not any near as large, um, and the Chinese defense budget is 25 times that of Taiwan.
mm.
So, could they take it? Yes, but at what cost? At what cost? But I think the semiconductor issue is important because you're right. Taiwan's semiconductor produces 90% of the high value added chips,
Mm,
uh, and so the U.S. is really over a barrel here. China's been poaching engineers from Taiwan Semiconductor. I read something just the other day that they've already poached 3,000 software engineers from Taiwan Semiconductor. They're always trying to
mm.
get as much intelligence. I'm sure they're stealing quite a bit as well. Um,
Yeah.
but I'm sure China has a plan. If they did take Taiwan, they're not going to like blow up the island. They would
No.
they would take it in a way that they could take Taiwan Semiconductor intact.
Mm,
Um, but that, I put it this way: if China takes Taiwan and either we don't fight or we fight and we lose, um, the U.S. is pretty much the game for the U.S. in Asia is much diminished. I mean, we would be very diminished we would not be a superpower because we would not be seen as a major Asian power.
I completely agree, and I guess my follow up to that is, what does the United States government, or I should say, what should the U.S. be doing right now, and what should the U.S. be doing between now and 2030 to maintain its superpower status? So, like for example, um, you know. I guess my question is, do you feel like this administration is doing enough right now? Is there more that they could be doing? In your opinion, what should we be doing right now over the next 8 years to ensure that we don't lose to China on a economic front, we don't lose to
Yeah.
China on a military front?
Well, I think, a lot of people, when they think about it, they think about what can we do towards China. Like during the Trump administration, we slapped tariffs on them and we
Sure.
threatened them and we clamped down on Huawei. And some of those things are good things. I mean, definitely there was a change of tone from just cooperation to, a more confrontational attitude, which I think was more than warranted. But
Mm,
the way I look at it, I mean, we need a more agile Pentagon because we're already
mm,
spending a lot of money. I mean, we've spent close to $20 trillion since the end of the Cold War. China
mm,
spent $3 trillion
mm,
over that time period, but yet we need to spend more and more and more money because our forces are spread out all over the world. Obviously, we're distracted by what's happening in Ukraine. So I think we
mm,
need to focus more on the Navy, more on maritime defense. The Marines are reforming. and then of course air and space. But we have to be a lot more agile on that front. And then on the economic front, we need. I see the chief threat as the debt, the budget deficits and the debt. And it doesn't sound like there's a link, but there's a strong link because the more we add to the debt, interest payments go up. I mean, if interest rates just went up 2%, our annual interest rate payment on the federal debt would triple and might be as large as our defense budget. So that's really important. And then the other thing is we need to unify the country more because we need a country that is seen by the rest of the world as dynamic and stable. That's always been the U.S. brand, and that's how we became a superpower. So we have to get our economic house in order, and then we have to have a much smarter foreign policy and defense policy.
Okay, well, very interesting, and yeah, I absolutely agree. I mean, we're not going to engage with anybody, especially China, if we're not unified in our goals. And I think describing those goals is very important. One thing that I don't know how many episodes you've watched, but one thing that we try to cover or that we're laser focused on is not just the rare earth industry, but the nuclear industry and how it sort of ties into that. Yeah. So obviously we talk a lot about the establishment of a thorium co-op that would store thorium on behalf of the rare earth, mining companies so that they can mine and process those materials so that they can make electronics and create job opportunities here in America. Alternatively, we take that thorium and we develop markets and uses for it, specifically as it pertains to energy. That's not to say that we should only be looking at thorium. Obviously, there's other materials that we could look into. We interviewed a company not that long ago that is developing a special type of reactor that runs on spent nuclear fuel. And what I heard, as a resource, what we how long that would last us here in the United States, just spent nuclear fuel alone, it's like something like 3 centuries or something like that. So obviously we have a lot of intellectual potential to actually build some of the machines that would have some very amazing, like medium and long-term economic consequences for the country. Obviously there's some regulatory policy in the way. I guess aside from nuclear policy in the United States, and if you want to jump in here on nuclear policy, I'd be happy to hear your opinion on that. Is there any other regulatory policy that you see as kind of holding America back in regards to where we could be in terms of not just unifying the country, but also, rebuilding our economy and trying to getting us back on the right path before this decade is out?
Well, I do talk about nuclear power in my book, but before I tell you what I advocate, I think in terms of directly with China, we definitely have to pull critical supply chains out of China, which over the last 3 decades, John Kenneth Galbraith calls it sophisticated stupidity. How we let all our supply chains, our basic industrial capacity, migrate to China, basically driven by the lower costs, higher profits, greed. Let's face it. People wanted to make money, and they weren't thinking about the national interest. No. And the U.S. government was, market based, and so we didn't interfere. Basically, S&P 500 ran our foreign economic policy. Well, it's time to reverse that. Not everything, but in critical areas, we need to pull that back. And then we also have to regulate the capital, because a lot of U.S. capital is still headed to China, and we need it back here. We need it back here because we have to invest in growth here. Now, on the nuclear issue, I probably don't know anywhere near what you and your usual guest knows, but it just makes complete sense to me. I've been reading about the 4th generation nuclear technology, much safer, much cleaner. You can recycle some of the waste. I've read so many things, how it's so much more promising, and all these concerns about accidents and so on. That's old technology. I've read about the thorium reactors. So I think we really need to be, at the very least, open-minded. Politicians do not want to talk about nuclear power, but we really need to elevate it to 25 to 30% of our electricity mix. And that, let's face it, it's the cleanest. Well, it's the cleanest energy out there, and it could really change things. And one of the problems with Ukraine and Western Europe is they all started pulling away. Germany pulled away from nuclear power. Yeah. France pulled away a little bit. Japan pulled away, and now they're scrambling to go the other way. So I think that was a terrible blunder. So I'm a big advocate of nuclear power, but it really has to, as you know, the American people have to be educated, and politicians have to have a little bit of courage.
Well, that is something that we try to do, is just to try and provide some educational resources for people here that want to learn more about some of this great stuff. And we interview a lot of people who are involved in that space and are trying to make a go of it. Some are having more success than others, and that's really exciting. I guess.
And by the way, China's building a lot of reactors. I mean, everybody talks about their coal, and they are, because of what's going on, they are building more coal plants. But they got a lot of technology from the United States. Yeah, and they're off and running.
Well, they're doing a lot more than that. We've done several episodes talking about China. We've talked about their thorium program. We've talked about their nuclear program, and I've actually given them quite a bit of praise. I mean, I'm very critical of China. I'm very critical of the CCP and some of their from a policy standpoint. But in terms of their effectiveness, in terms of rolling out nuclear power, I have to say I've seen nothing like it. Even comparing it, you mentioned France. France. In the early 70s, when the oil shock started happening, they made a very long-term decision that, okay, we don't have coal, we don't have natural gas, we don't want to be dependent on Northern Europe or in Russia. And obviously oil is not going to work out for us. So what can we do with the technology we have? Well, nuclear is good, but we have to build it out. It takes time. You need to cultivate, the best nuclear, engineers. And it took a long time. It took decades for France to get to that position. Yes. But, now they're like 3/4 of their electricity market is powered by, nuclear power. They usually, in the summertime, they might export that to other countries like Germany because, they produce so much excess, yes. And they reprocess their nuclear waste. And, to your point, they only can get a couple bites out of the apple, but it's better than what other countries, and that's including the U.S., do. And you're right. There are better reactors out there that actually can make better use of the spent fuel. They can do a better job in terms of processing, new nuclear fuels like thorium. Yeah. And, another thing that to point out, not just the fact that China built 50 reactors over the course of a decade, but they've made a substantial investment on a number of different reactors. So they're building fast reactors. They're building modular reactors. They're building high temperature reactors. The thorium program is obviously the one that my audience is more concerned about. And one of the things that I pointed out is, and one of my, I love thorium. I'll love thorium till the day I die. I think thorium's great, but the problem with, thorium reactors that I've noticed is there's a serious issue when it relates to supply chain. And that's something that a lot of companies don't really understand. Some do, and they understand that is a big challenge. But right now, they're just trying to get through the regulatory aspect of it. In this country, that's very hard. In China, they recognize that off the bat. So aside from just saying, yeah, you can go ahead and build this reactor, also, we're going to subsidize a factory to be built that does the nuclear-rated graphite for the moderator. We're going to enrich a lithium-7 so you can make flibe salt so that you can, so you can deal with the fuel solvents and the coolants. We don't have uranium-233, but we're going to go ahead and make it. In the meantime, use this stuff, use the U-235, and then, they have a very long-term approach on how they're dealing with supply chain and stuff. And it's just like, I look at this and it freaks the hell out of me because of the fact that here in this country, they're organized and they're well funded. We're not well, organized. And the primary reason is we have a lot of private companies that, have some really good ideas that want to actually build this. Some of them, like I said, are having a little bit more success than others. But unfortunately, they're at the end of the day, they're just private companies, and they just don't have the support that they need from this government. So I'd like to
Yes.
see, yeah,
Yeah. No,
I'd
I
like,
agree. Yeah,
yeah, I mean,
you're looking at the next quarter. I mean, also an investment guy, and so these
oh,
companies they're looking to the next quarter, maybe a year out, but they're not looking 5, 10, 15 years out because they're going to be gone. Whereas the
mm,
Chinese, whether it's state owned or whether it's private, with the state companies overseeing it and regulating it, they look at the total picture. They've done it in rare earths. You see them; they're going to dominate electric vehicles because they have the
mm,
whole supply chain there. And one way I put it is they're a supply chain superpower. They really are.
yeah,
They vertically integrate, they think it through, and they put the pieces of the puzzle together. We've got to do
mm,
that better. I mean, yeah, it's going to have to be led by the private sector, but our government's got to get a lot smarter about who we fund, um, in what sectors, not picking companies, but picking sectors and then figuring out. The Japanese were tremendous at this and still are good at it as well.
yeah,
And, Japan was our rival, right? In the
mm,
60s, 70s, and 80s. That's when I
mm,
was living in Japan. And the Soviet
mm,
Union, by the way, was our rival, right? Was a superpower, but it was really just ideological and military. But
yeah,
China, the scary thing about China is its full spectrum, what they call a full spectrum peer rival:
mm,
military, ideological, economic, technology, just about anything you can think of. They're our rival.
yeah,
And so we really have to be unified. I mean, we can have a clash of opinions, but we have to
sure.
be a unity of purpose, and that's to stay a superpower and stay number one. I mean, I can't imagine America, number two or number three. I don't know about you. I just can't
No,
imagine.
I mean, I live here. I don't want to, for someone who's grown up an American his whole life, I can't say that I foresee a. I'm not saying it's not possible, but it's hard for me to imagine a world in where America is not at least taking charge or taking the lead on a lot of major issues,
Right.
geopolitical in nature. Uh, you know, um, you start seeing stuff like, I mean, I guess, going back, even, 7 to 10 years ago, I mean, you started seeing that with, the Russian intervention in Syria, helping the Assad regime,
Right.
maintain power and going after ISIS, and the fact that we weren't really, at least at that time, of course, we started making some changes later on down the road, but we weren't really leading the charge on taking out one of the most notorious terrorist organizations on planet Earth. Back then, I just didn't think that there was any hope. I mean, it took. A lot of people don't realize that there is a path to where we can get America back on track, and we can get the economy back in order, and we can get things going again. I don't know if that's going to happen with this administration or a new administration down the road. There's
Yeah.
an election happening this year, and I don't
Right.
know what your thoughts on that, but I
Yeah.
I, I think regardless of the midterm outcome, I have some doubts as to whether or not the leadership in this country is going to, and that's general. I'm not pointing at any
Yeah. Yeah.
individual person, but I have some doubts, at least in the short term, that we're going to get our act together and stuff. But maybe I'm wrong. I mean, you seem to have a
Yeah.
little bit more insight on that than I do. So I
Well,
guess,
yeah.
oh, go ahead.
Well, the point I would make is I'll be upfront. I mean, I'm a Republican. I always vote Republican. But what
Mm,
bothers me is that we have this like ping pong. One administration comes in, and the other party comes in, and it'd be one thing if they came in with a mandate, with an agenda, and then they
yeah,
were able to execute that, and then people would judge whether they whether they're doing a
yeah,
good job. But we have these like tiny margins now. So whoever comes in, I mean, the Trump administration had a wonderful opportunity. They had the presidency, the House, and the Senate, but they didn't use it effectively in those 2 years, and then they
I
lost
agree.
the House. And now we have the situation where the Senate is almost equally divided, and the White House has been trading partners, so to speak. What I
Mm,
think we need in 20 as a Republican is what I'd like to see us is get back to that governing majority with a mandate, a clear mandate. Uh, you know, Instead of getting 46, 47% of the vote, we get 55% of the vote.
Mm.
and control the Senate and the House, and then we can really take action and be judged on how we do. And that depends on the agenda, right? Because you got to attract independent voters. If you want to get to 55%, you got to attract very conservative Democrats and these independent voters, which are very important. I mean, it's 40% of New Hampshire. It's 40% of my home state of Wisconsin. It's 40% of my adopted state, Colorado. We got to appeal to these voters.
Yeah, I agree. And
something I wanted to mention to you on the nuclear power, right? Something I recently read. I don't know if you have an opinion, but I read a very encouraging piece about nuclear fusion relative to nuclear fission, that there's this huge international program in France where things look very promising for that, which could solve a lot of our, not just our problems, but the world's problems.
So that's a very good point, and I've actually had some people from NTD News ask my opinion on that. So I'm familiar with the program you're referring to. I'm familiar with ITER,
Yes.
but so my opinion, they're doing good work over there. But my biggest problem is that back in the 80s, they had a really, there was a really robust approach, and there was this international competition. You had a lot of different countries working towards fusion. So the American, program was different from the Russian program, was different from the, French or the Japanese program. Everyone had a different approach, and they wanted to do it. I don't know when the switch happened. Obviously I was, barely existent at that point, so my history is a little fuzzy on that. But at some point, the program was internationalized, and for I think like 10 to 15 years, there was a debate on where they were going to put this international collaborative reactor program. And then when they finally did, they started building it. The problem is that they're using a lot of dated technology. They're using these superconducting magnets that we had access to back in the 1990s. And look, they're great magnets. They'll definitely work. It'll definitely do the job. But the thing that we actually covered a number of different companies that are in the private sector that have received an enormous amount of funding. And we're talking about like billions of dollars in private funding in regards to fusion research. One is a company called Commonwealth Fusion. And they're based out of Massachusetts. It's actually a program that was bred out of a few MIT nuclear engineers that were working on the fusion program over there, and they wanted to, I guess, start a private company to that effort. They actually were so effective in kind of demonstrating, we think we have an approach here that can actually get us to achieve net gain energy efficiency on fusion, that they actually got some SpaceX engineers to quit SpaceX. Because, I know a couple of people at SpaceX, and they're like, we really love our job here. We think that we're doing some really good work. But there's some people out there who are like, whoa, what they're doing here at Commonwealth is pretty cool. We're going to go quit and we're going to go work for these guys because we think that they're on the right track to actually doing this. And their biggest thing is that they're building these really, really highly efficient they're like yttrium, barium, like rare earth magnets that are super small and compact, but very, very effective in terms of, generating a magnetic field within the small tokamak. And the reactor is far smaller, far more compact. The energy yield on it, they're projecting something like about 100 to 200 megawatts of power output, but it's really impressive, in terms of what they're seeing. And obviously they're convincing a lot of people in the private sector, like, hey, we're on the, we think we're on the right track here in terms of gaining that. And what I like about their reactor is they have a similar supply chain requirements that you would need for a lifter, which is a liquid fluoride thorium reactor. So you need what's referred to as FLIBE salts, like a combination of fluoride, lithium, beryllium. And, the companies that are looking to use FLIBE, to run thorium reactors, they're using it as a fuel solvent. The guys at Commonwealth, they're looking at using it as basically as a means to cool the inner and outer walls of the reactor and to prevent neutrons from escaping the reactor and kind of absorbing it to make tritium to go back into the reactor itself. So they're doing some really cool stuff with that.
Yeah.
And I'm hoping they make it. There's another company in Seattle called Helion. They're completely different approach, but they're doing a neutronic fusion, which I think is even cooler because They're not even talking about building turbines to generate to do the power conversion. They're talking about absorbing charged particles from the reactor itself and then using that through direct conversion to generate electricity. So
Oh, interesting.
that
See,
yeah
yeah, I like what I love that. See, this is what one of my goals is, and maybe I'm not being realistic. You tell me, but I would like all Americans, from kids in school to, someone in the media, like what you're doing, to look at all the issues through the power rivalry, the U.S.-China rivalry, and take action based on how do we win that rivalry in whatever space you're in. If you're in high school and you're studying, you go, I don't really want to study. Well, you got to study because the Chinese are studying. We got to compete.
yeah
I'm hoping, and we're going to have we want to stay a capitalist economy. We want to expand capitalism, but it's going to be our own breed. We shouldn't follow what the Chinese are doing, but we can learn from what they're doing and what the Japanese are doing. And the state should have a light touch, but it should play a role in trying to at least help direct capital. Because if you just leave the private sector to do it, you're going to have these gaping vulnerabilities like we have with semiconductors, rare earths, rare metals. They closed the Bureau of Mines in 1987. You remember? You remember Dick Darman when he said semiconductor chips, potato chips? What's the difference?
I don't remember it.
Yeah.
I mean, I was barely existent at that time. I was
really younger.
yeah.
I remember.
I won't say.
Yeah.
But no, I mean that was tragic. And if we did have a Bureau of Mines, maybe we would have had more of a. I can't say that for sure, but maybe we would have had more of a vested interest in protecting the rare earth industry. I think one of the biggest crimes of the late 20th century is the fact that we were leading in the production of rare earth materials up until the mid 1980s, and through just a plethora of bad political decisions and some very short-sighted regulatory issues that we just said, you know what, it's
we had the one rare earth mine, right? Mountain Pass.
Yeah.
And we believe in the private sector. So Unocal went in there, it fell apart. Then Molycorp moved in, and they took a wild bet and went bankrupt. And now we have a private equity firm with a 9% Chinese partner, Shengyi, and all the rare earth concentrates being shipped to China for processing.
Yeah, no.
There's no way China would ever allow that mine to be mismanaged.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree with you more. And we actually had a policy expert, kind of give us his take on what the best approach was. And I completely agree that, again, it's good for private companies to invest in these rare earth mines. It's bad when they're competing with China, who can basically say, "Oh, did we say $10? We'll bring it down to $2," and just basically price everybody out of the market to the point where you can't really be in the business. There needs to be some sort of a cooperative structure in terms of getting some stakeholders in the game saying, "Look, we will provide you this material. We will allow you to buy it at a fair price. As long as you buy from us, we will guarantee that this supply is accessible to you. All that we ask is that you make us your exclusive supplier, and you help us, in terms of building out this industry, building out the rare earth refineries and all that other stuff." Because again, I'm not saying that we can't have other countries involved in this business. I'd actually prefer it if other countries like Malaysia and Indonesia. Yeah, I mean, I'd love to see more from Malaysia and Indonesia get into it. I'd love
Vietnam, the Philippines.
Absolutely.
By the way, as you know, it's everybody focuses on we need to have produce rare earth oxides, but what about the permanent magnets? What about making the alloys? And what about the final application? If everything's made in China, right? If you don't have the manufacturing supply chain here in the United States, well, even if you create the oxides, they're going to get shipped to China to be made into the final product. So it was really short-sighted what we did, and it's amazing that it happened. So now we got to claw it back. We have to claw it back because the Chinese were very, very adroit of using their big consumer market, low wages and costs, and the to and attractive investment opportunities for the private sector, not just U.S., China, Taiwan, South Korea. Everybody just flooded into that market, and it really turned China into a manufacturing superpower.
Well, on that note, we do need to wrap up here. So I guess a couple of things. One, loved having you on the show. Definitely planning on getting your book. Again, that's Power Rivals, and we're going to leave a link on the description below. And Carl, if you don't mind, we'd love to have you back on the show sometime in the near future, because I'm sure that we're not going to be done talking about China and the U.S. as it relates to our global superpower status. But I guess before we sign off here today, was there anything that you wanted to leave off, just any final thoughts or anything like that?
Only thing I will say is what the area that your focus at Rock Logic in terms of basic materials, critical materials, it's absolutely a crucial part of one of the building blocks to get America back in the game, back as an industrial power. And remember, when this country was founded in 17, Declaration of Independence in 1776, and the Treaty of Paris was signed in 1783. China was the world's superpower, and they want to be it again.
Yeah. Well said. Well, Carl, thank you so much for coming on the show today. Again, love to have you back on, and you have a good one, sir.
Thank you, Sean.
Okay.